The afternoon light hung low over Lake Winona in northern Minnesota, casting long shadows across the frozen surface that locals had trusted for generations. It was January 14th, a Monday afternoon when the temperature hadn't climbed above 15 degrees Fahrenheit all day, and most sensible people stayed indoors with their thermostats cranked high and hot chocolate warming their hands. The lake had frozen solid weeks earlier, that inevitable transformation that happened every winter when the temperatures dropped and stayed down, turning the water into a vast sheet of white that stretched nearly 2 miles across at its widest point. Ice fishermen had already set up their shanties in the deeper sections, drilling holes and dropping lines for walleye and northern pike, trusting in the thickness that Minnesota winters reliably provided. But not all ice was created equal, and those who'd grown up on these shores knew to respect the unpredictable patches near creek inlets, where moving water kept things thinner than they appeared. 15-year-old Tyler Bennett knew this better than most. He'd grown up in a small house on the eastern shore, learned to skate before he could ride a bike, spent summers swimming off the dock, and winters playing pickup hockey with neighborhood kids on the frozen expanse. His Uncle Jack, a fish and wildlife officer, had drilled water safety into him since he was old enough to understand, teaching him how to read ice conditions, how to distribute weight when crossing questionable patches, how to self-rescue if he ever went through. Tyler had listened to those lessons the way most teenagers listen to adult warnings, with half his attention and the assumption that bad things happen to other people, never to him. That particular Monday afternoon, he was walking home from basketball practice at Winona High School, his gym bag slung over his shoulder, earbuds in, listening to a playlist that mixed hip-hop with alternative rock in a combination only a 15-year-old would consider coherent. He was thinking about the game scheduled for next Friday against their rivals from Lakeville, worrying about whether Coach Patterson would actually let him start or keep him on the bench for the first quarter like he had all season. He was thinking about Amy Clarkson, who sat 2 rows ahead of him in English class, and who'd smiled at him that morning in a way that might have meant something or might have meant absolutely nothing. He was thinking about the physics homework he hadn't finished, and whether his mom would notice if he turned in something half-complete. He was thinking about all the ordinary concerns that fill a sophomore's mind on a cold Monday in January, walking a route he'd taken thousands of times, barely glancing at the familiar landscape of frozen lake and empty summer cabins and bare trees standing like sentinels against the grey sky. Then he heard it. The sound cut through his music even though he had the volume up too loud, the way his mother always complained about, telling him he'd damage his hearing by the time he was 30. It was a sound that didn't belong in the quiet winter afternoon, sharp and distinct and wrong, in a way that made his stomach clench before his brain fully processed what he was hearing. A crack, loud as a gunshot, followed immediately by a splash and then screaming, high-pitched and desperate and absolutely terrified. Tyler ripped the earbuds from his ears, his head snapping toward the lake, his eyes scanning the white expanse for the source of the noise. It took him 3 seconds to locate it, 3 seconds that would replay in his memory for years afterward in slow motion, every detail crystal clear. About 40 yards from shore, near the mouth of Henson Creek where it fed into the lake, there was a dark gash in the white ice, a hole maybe 4 or 5 feet across, its edges jagged and black against the surrounding snow. Kneeling at the edge of that hole was a woman in a red parka, her arms plunged into the water up to her shoulders, her body convulsing with sobs, her voice raw as she screamed words that Tyler couldn't quite make out, but whose meaning was absolutely clear. Someone had gone through the ice. Someone was in that water. Someone was drowning right now, 40 yards from shore, and this woman was trying to reach them and failing. Tyler's brain went into a strange mode, everything suddenly sharp and slow at the same time. His heartbeat loud in his ears, his breath coming fast. He didn't remember making a decision. He didn't remember weighing options or considering consequences or thinking about what his uncle had taught him about ice rescue protocols. His body simply moved, some deeper instinct taking over, his gym bag hitting the snow-covered path as he broke into a run toward the shoreline. His sneakers pounded against the packed snow, his arms pumping, his eyes locked on that red parka and the black hole and the woman who was now screaming actual words he could understand as he got closer. "My baby! Oh God, somebody help! My baby's in the water. He went under the ice. Please, somebody help me!" Tyler hit the shoreline at full speed, his momentum carrying him onto the ice before he consciously decided to step onto it. The surface was solid here, thick and reliable, but he forced himself to slow down, to remember what Uncle Jack had taught him about distributing weight, about sliding rather than running, about testing each step. He could see the woman more clearly now, see that her hands were bright red from the cold water, that her face was a mask of pure terror, tears streaming down her cheeks, her lips already turning blue from exposure. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wild and desperate, and she shouted at him, "There's a little boy under the ice. He fell through and now he's under there. I can see him, but I can't reach him. Please, you have to help him." Tyler dropped to his hands and knees as he got closer to the hole, crawling the last 10 feet to distribute his weight more evenly, and when he reached the edge and looked down into the dark water, his heart nearly stopped. There, visible through the cloudy white ice about 3 feet from the hole, was a small, dark shape, a child's body, suspended in the water beneath the frozen surface, completely still, arms floating out to the sides, face pale and eyes closed. The current was pulling him slowly away from the opening, inch by inch, and Tyler understood with sudden clarity that every second mattered, that this child had already been under for at least a minute, maybe 2, and that the survival window was closing fast. He knew the statistics because they'd been drilled into every Minnesota kid through school assemblies and safety programs and public service announcements. Cold water shock could incapacitate you in less than a minute. Hypothermia shut down your body's core functions. You had maybe 10 to 15 minutes in water this cold before you lost consciousness. Less if you panicked and inhaled water, and this child had already used up precious minutes of that window. Tyler looked at the woman, really looked at her, and saw the absolute helplessness in her eyes, the knowledge that she was watching her child die and couldn't do anything to stop it. She tried to reach in, but the shelf of ice around the hole kept breaking under her weight, sending her sliding backward, and she wasn't a strong swimmer even in warm water, let alone in near-freezing conditions with winter clothes weighing her down. Someone needed to go in, someone needed to go under that ice and pull that child out right now, immediately, before the current carried him too far away or before his oxygen-deprived brain suffered irreversible damage. Every instinct Tyler had developed over 15 years of cautious living told him to run back to the trail, flag down a car, call 911, wait for trained professionals with ropes and dry suits and rescue equipment. But he also knew, with the absolute certainty that comes only in moments of crisis, that by the time help arrived, this child would be dead. The fire station was 12 minutes away. The ambulance would take at least that long to arrive, probably longer given the snow on the roads. The sheriff's water rescue team would need time to assemble and deploy. This child didn't have 12 minutes. He probably didn't have 5. Tyler kicked off his sneakers, yanked his heavy winter coat over his head, and tossed it aside, stripping down to his hoodie and practice jersey and jeans. The cold hit him immediately, biting through the thinner layers like teeth, raising goosebumps across his skin. He looked at the woman one more time and asked, his voice steadier than he felt, "What's his name?" She stared at him, not understanding at first, then choked out, "Dylan. His name is Dylan Hartley. He's 5 years old. Please, please save my baby." Tyler nodded once, positioned himself at the edge of the hole, and before he could second-guess the decision or think too hard about what he was doing, he lowered himself feet first into the water. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Now, let's get back to Tyler's incredible rescue attempt. The cold was unlike anything Tyler had ever experienced in his life, and he'd grown up in Minnesota winters, had jumped into cold lakes on early summer mornings, had fallen through thin ice once when he was 8, and his uncle had pulled him out within seconds. This was different. This wasn't just cold. It was violence, a physical assault that hit every nerve ending in his body simultaneously and squeezed his chest like a vice made of ice. The shock drove the air from his lungs in an involuntary gasp, his body going into immediate panic mode, every muscle seizing up, his brain screaming at him to get out now. This is wrong, this is death. Get out. For 3 full seconds he couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except experience the overwhelming wrongness of the temperature and fight the urge to hyperventilate. His hands gripped the edge of the ice, his body half in and half out of the water, and for those 3 seconds he genuinely didn't know if he could do this, if his body would even obey the commands his mind was trying to send. Then training kicked in. All those swimming lessons at the community center, all those water safety courses his uncle had made him take, all that muscle memory of controlling panic and regulating breathing in difficult conditions. Tyler forced himself to take a breath, short and sharp and painful in his throat, then another, getting his respiratory system under control. He released his grip on the ice and pushed himself fully into the water, the cold enveloping him completely, his clothes immediately soaking through and becoming heavy, dragging at his limbs. He took one more breath, the deepest one he could manage, and ducked his head under the surface. The world beneath the ice was eerily silent and dim, all sound muffled to a dull nothingness, light filtering through the frozen ceiling above in weak bluish-white tones that made everything look ghostly and unreal. Tyler opened his eyes despite the burning cold and the murky quality of the water, and he scanned the space around him, forcing his vision to adjust to the dimness. There, maybe 8 or 10 feet away and drifting slowly toward the deeper water where the lake bottom dropped off sharply, was Dylan Hartley. The boy's small body was completely limp, his winter coat billowing around him like a dark cloud, his arms floating upward, one small hand visible with fingers slightly curled, his face pale as paper, lips blue, eyes closed. Tyler kicked hard, his legs pushing against the water, his arms pulling in strong strokes, covering the distance in what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 4 or 5 seconds. His fingers closed around Dylan's coat, gripping the fabric tightly, and he pulled the child close, wrapping one arm around the small torso. The boy was completely unresponsive, no movement at all, and Tyler didn't let himself think about what that might mean, didn't let himself consider the possibility that he was already too late. He kicked toward where he thought the hole was, but the current and his own disorientation underwater had turned him around, and in the dim greenish light filtering through the ice, every direction looked the same. Panic fluttered in his chest again, a different kind this time, the panic of being lost, of not knowing which way was out, of burning through precious oxygen while swimming in the wrong direction. Tyler forced it down, made himself stop moving for just a second, made himself look up at the ice ceiling above him. Most of it was white and cloudy, light diffusing through evenly, but there, off to his left, was a patch of darker color, a square of deeper shadow that had to be the hole, the opening to air and survival. He adjusted his trajectory, kicked hard with both legs, pulled with his free arm, dragging Dylan with him. His lungs were starting to burn now. That familiar ache that meant he was running out of air, that meant he had maybe 10 or 15 more seconds before his body would start demanding that he breathe, whether there was air available or not. He kicked again, harder, his muscles screaming, the cold sapping his strength faster than he'd anticipated. His free hand hit the edge of the ice hole, and he pulled himself and Dylan toward it, breaking the surface with a gasp that felt like swallowing fire and ice simultaneously. The air hit his wet face, and it was so cold it burned, but he sucked it in gratefully, coughing, trying to get his bearings. Jennifer Hartley was there immediately, her hands reaching down, grabbing at her son, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Give him to me! Give him to me! Oh, God, Dylan, baby, please!" Tyler pushed Dylan up toward her, using the last reserves of his strength to lift the small body high enough that she could get her hands under his arms. She pulled, and Tyler pushed from below, and together they got the boy up and out of the water onto the ice. Then there were other hands there too, voices shouting, and Tyler realized through his cold-fogged brain that other people had arrived, drawn by the screaming, at least 4 or 5 adults now gathered at the scene. Someone grabbed Tyler's wrist, a strong grip, and hauled him up and out of the water, and suddenly he was lying on his back on the ice, his entire body shaking so violently that his teeth were clacking together, convulsions racking him from head to toe that he couldn't control no matter how hard he tried. Someone threw a coat over him, then another, heavy fabric that should have felt warm, but just felt like weight. Tyler forced himself to roll onto his side, forced himself to look toward where Dylan was, needing to see what was happening, needing to know if any of this had mattered. The scene was controlled chaos. Jennifer Hartley had Dylan on his back on the ice, and a heavy-set man with a grey beard was kneeling beside them, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, his voice calm and authoritative in a way that cut through the panic. "Mom, I need you to step back and let me work. I'm a paramedic. Let me help him." The man tilted Dylan's head back carefully, checked his airway with 2 fingers, put his ear near the boy's mouth, listening for breath sounds that Tyler couldn't hear from where he lay shaking on the ice. Then the man positioned his hands on Dylan's small chest, laced his fingers together, and began compressions, counting out loud in a steady rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Tyler watched through chattering teeth as the paramedic worked, 30 compressions delivered with careful force calibrated for a child's smaller body, then 2 rescue breaths, the man's mouth covering Dylan's nose and mouth, air going in, the small chest rising slightly then falling, then another round of compressions, the count starting over, the rhythm never varying. Jennifer Hartley was on her knees beside them, her hands pressed to her mouth, her whole body shaking with sobs, watching her son lie motionless on the ice while a stranger tried to restart his heart and lungs. The other bystanders stood in a loose circle, helpless, someone talking on a cell phone, presumably to 911, someone else holding a blanket, everyone watching and hoping and fearing. Tyler's whole body hurt, a deep ache in his muscles and bones that felt like he'd been beaten with hammers, but he couldn't look away from Dylan, couldn't stop watching those tiny compressions, that small chest rising and falling artificially as the paramedic breathed for him. The seconds stretched out, each one an eternity, each one bringing them closer to the moment when the paramedic would have to stop, would have to look at Jennifer Hartley and deliver the worst news any parent could hear. Tyler felt something cold and heavy settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the lake water soaking his clothes or the hypothermia setting into his core. He'd been too late. He'd tried, had done everything he could think of, had risked his own life going into that water and under that ice, but it hadn't been enough. Dylan had been submerged too long, had been without oxygen for too many critical minutes, and now Tyler was watching him die on the ice 40 yards from shore, while his mother sobbed, and strangers stood helpless, and the winter sun hung low and cold in the grey Minnesota sky. The paramedic was starting his 3rd round of compressions when it happened. Dylan coughed. It was such a small sound, barely audible, wet and weak and fragile. But it was life. It was the sound of a body fighting back, of lungs trying to work again, of a heart that hadn't given up yet. The paramedic immediately rolled Dylan onto his side, supporting his head and neck, and the boy coughed again, harder this time, then vomited up what seemed like an impossible amount of lake water, choking and gagging, his small body convulsing with the effort. Then finally, blessedly, he cried. It was a thin sound, scared and hurt and confused, but it was the most beautiful sound Tyler Bennett had ever heard in his 15 years of life. It meant Dylan was breathing. It meant his brain was working. It meant he was alive. Jennifer Hartley collapsed over her son, wrapping him in her arms carefully, mindful of the paramedic's warning not to move him too much, and she sobbed into his wet hair, saying his name over and over like a prayer. "Dylan, baby, Mommy's here. You're okay, you're okay. Oh God, you're okay." Someone had called 911 right when the accident happened, and the distant wail of sirens grew louder now, multiple emergency vehicles converging on the lake from different directions, their lights visible through the bare trees along the shore road. Within minutes, the scene was flooded with professionals, paramedics and EMTs, and sheriff's deputies, people with equipment and training and protocols, taking over the rescue that civilians had started. They loaded Dylan onto a backboard with careful precision, checking his vital signs, getting an oxygen mask on his small face, wrapping him in specialized thermal blankets designed to gradually warm hypothermia victims without shocking their systems. They loaded Tyler onto a stretcher, despite his weak protests that he could walk, that he was fine, that they should focus on Dylan. "Son, you just spent several minutes in near-freezing water," one of the EMTs said firmly, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and no-nonsense authority. "You're going to the hospital for observation, whether you like it or not. You're a hero, but you're also a hypothermia patient, and we're not taking chances." They checked his core temperature with a special thermometer, and the EMT frowned at the reading. 93.2. She said to her partner, "Moderate hypothermia. Let's get him in the warm rig." They loaded both Tyler and Dylan into separate ambulances, and as Tyler's rig pulled away from the lake, lights flashing and siren wailing, he caught a glimpse of Jennifer Hartley climbing into the other ambulance with her son, still crying, still holding Dylan's hand, still whispering to him. The ride to Winona General Hospital was a blur of warm air blasting from vents, heated blankets being piled on top of him, and EMTs asking him questions he struggled to answer through his shivering. How long was he in the water? Maybe 2 minutes, he thought, maybe 3. Did he lose consciousness at any point? No. Was he having any chest pain or difficulty breathing? Just cold, so cold his bones hurt. At the hospital, they wheeled him straight into a treatment room and transferred him into a specialized warm water immersion tank, gradually raising his body temperature in controlled increments to avoid cardiac complications that could occur if warming happened too fast. The water felt scalding hot, even though the thermometer read only 98 degrees, his cold, shocked nerves sending confused signals to his brain. They monitored his heart rhythm continuously, watching for the dangerous arrhythmias that sometimes accompanied hypothermia. But Tyler's young, healthy heart kept beating steadily, adjusting to the temperature changes without complaint. His parents arrived within 20 minutes. His mother, Rebecca, bursting through the emergency room doors with terror written across her face. His father, Michael, right behind her, both of them having broken every speed limit between their house on Maple Street and the hospital. They'd gotten the call from the sheriff's department, a brief notification that their son had performed a water rescue at Lake Winona and was being treated for hypothermia at Winona General, and they'd left immediately without even locking the front door. When Rebecca saw Tyler in the warming tank, wrapped in heated blankets, electrodes stuck to his chest, monitoring his heart, she started crying, and Michael gripped his son's shoulder with the kind of fierce pride mixed with fear that only a parent can feel when their child does something incredibly brave and incredibly dangerous. Tyler spent 4 hours in the emergency room, long enough for his core temperature to return to normal, long enough for the violent shivering to finally stop, and the feeling to fully return to his fingers and toes. Long enough for the adrenaline to wear off and exhaustion to set in, the emergency room doctor, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Dr. Patel, gave him a thorough examination and a stern lecture about the risks of cold water immersion, the dangers of going under ice, the statistical likelihood that Tyler could have died doing what he did. "You're lucky you had swimming experience and didn't panic," Dr. Patel said seriously. "Most people who go into water that cold either can't function due to cold shock or they hyperventilate and drown within a minute or two. You had maybe a 20% chance of getting yourself out of that water alive, and even lower odds of getting the boy out too. What you did was incredibly brave and incredibly foolish in equal measure." Tyler nodded, too tired to argue. But he also knew that if he had to do it again, he would make the same choice every time. Dr. Patel softened slightly, seeing the exhaustion in Tyler's eyes. "That said, that little boy is alive because of you. He's 3 rooms down the hall being treated for hypothermia and near drowning, but the paramedics say he's responsive and his vitals are stabilizing. They expect him to make a full recovery. You saved his life." Those words settled into Tyler's chest, heavy and warm, and suddenly he was crying, tears running down his face that he couldn't stop and didn't want to stop, all the fear and adrenaline and relief pouring out of him at once. His mother held him, and his father gripped his shoulder, and for several minutes they just sat there in the emergency room, a family grateful that everyone had survived this impossible day. The story spread through Winona with the speed that only small-town news can travel. Phone trees and text chains and social media posts carrying the details to every corner of the community within hours. By Tuesday morning, Tyler's phone was flooded with messages from classmates and teachers, from neighbors and relatives, from people he barely knew who wanted to tell him he was a hero. The local newspaper, the Winona Daily News, ran the story on the front page under the headline, "Teen Hero Saves Child from Frozen Lake," with a photo of the rescue site showing the hole in the ice and the emergency vehicles on the shore. A reporter had interviewed the off-duty paramedic who'd performed CPR, a man named Robert Chen, who worked for the city's emergency services and had just happened to be driving past when he heard the screaming. Chen told the paper that without Tyler's quick action to retrieve Dylan from under the ice, no amount of CPR would have mattered because the boy would have drifted too far away to recover. Within 48 hours, the story had been picked up by the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, then by regional television news stations, then by national outlets always hungry for feel-good stories about teenage heroes and dramatic rescues. Tyler tried to downplay his role in every interview, insisting that anyone would have done the same thing, that he'd just reacted without thinking, that the real hero was Robert Chen, who'd kept Dylan alive with CPR until the paramedics arrived. But the narrative had already taken hold in the public imagination. The story of a 15-year-old high school basketball player who jumped into a frozen lake and gone under the ice to save a drowning 5-year-old, risking his own life without hesitation. It was the kind of story that restored people's faith in humanity, that reminded them courage still existed in the world, that proved teenagers weren't all self-absorbed and glued to their phones like the stereotypes suggested. Cable news ran the story during their morning shows, with anchors in New York studios marveling at Tyler's bravery while showing B-roll footage of Lake Winona and the Winona High School basketball team. Social media exploded with shares and comments, with people from around the country and eventually around the world weighing in, calling Tyler a hero, saying they'd be proud if their son showed that kind of courage, debating whether they themselves would have had the guts to enter that water. The attention was overwhelming for a 15-year-old who'd just been walking home from basketball practice, thinking about homework and girls and Friday's game. Tyler didn't feel like a hero. He felt exhausted and sore and slightly embarrassed by all the fuss, And he kept thinking about those 3 seconds when he'd first entered the water and hadn't been sure he could do it, when his body had seized up and panic had almost won. Heroes in movies never hesitated, never felt fear, never had moments of doubt, but Tyler had felt all those things, had experienced genuine terror both during the rescue and afterward when he'd lain shaking on the ice, wondering if Dylan would survive. The fact that he'd acted despite the fear, that he'd pushed through the doubt and done what needed doing, that was what people seemed to find inspiring, though Tyler himself didn't fully understand why. 2 weeks after the rescue, the town organized a recognition ceremony at Winona High School's gymnasium, and it seemed like half the town showed up, packing the bleachers with students and teachers and community members who wanted to honor what Tyler had done. The mayor, a cheerful woman named Patricia Morrison, presented him with an official citation for bravery, reading aloud from a prepared statement about courage and selflessness and the finest traditions of community service. The police chief, a gruff veteran named William Hayes, shook Tyler's hand with genuine respect and told him that the department had submitted his name for consideration for the Carnegie Hero Medal, one of the highest civilian awards for heroism in North America, given to people who risk their lives to save others. Tyler's basketball coach, a tough disciplinarian named Patterson, who rarely showed emotion, announced that the team was dedicating the rest of the season to Tyler and that he'd be starting in Friday's game, which made his teammates erupt in cheers and embarrassed Tyler so thoroughly his face turned bright red. But the moment that mattered most to Tyler, the moment that made everything else fade into background noise, came quietly and privately on a Saturday afternoon in early February, 3 weeks after the rescue, when Jennifer Hartley knocked on the Bennett family's front door with Dylan holding her hand. Tyler's mother answered, and when she saw who it was, she called for Tyler, her voice thick with emotion. Tyler came to the door and found Dylan fully recovered, dressed in a blue winter coat and jeans, bouncing slightly with the irrepressible energy of a healthy 5-year-old. Jennifer's eyes were already red, tears threatening to spill over, and she said simply, "We wanted to thank you in person. We wanted Dylan to see the person who saved his life." Dylan was shy at first, hiding partially behind his mother's leg, peeking out at Tyler with wide brown eyes that held the innocent curiosity of childhood, but none of the trauma of what he'd experienced. Jennifer had told Tyler over the phone that Dylan didn't remember much about the accident, just bits and pieces, the cold and the dark, and then waking up in a hospital with his mom holding his hand. The doctors said that was probably a mercy, that his brain had shut down those memories to protect him, and that he likely wouldn't be traumatized by the experience in the long term. Jennifer had brought him to Tyler's house, not because Dylan understood the magnitude of what had happened, but because she needed him to understand, needed him to know as he grew up, that a stranger had once loved him enough to risk death for him, that heroes were real and could look like high school sophomores in basketball practice gear. Tyler knelt down to Dylan's level, making himself smaller and less intimidating, and he smiled at the little boy. Dylan looked at him for a long moment, then said in a small voice, "My mom says you went swimming to get me." "Yeah, buddy," Tyler said, his throat suddenly tight. "I went swimming for you." Dylan considered this, his young brain processing the information, then asked with the logic of a 5-year-old, "Was the water cold?" Tyler laughed, surprised by the question, and nodded. "The water was very, very cold." "Did you get in trouble?" Dylan asked, genuinely concerned, because in his experience doing things adults told you not to do usually resulted in consequences. "No," Tyler assured him. "I didn't get in trouble. I was trying to help you." Dylan seemed satisfied with this answer, and after another moment of thought, he stepped out from behind his mother's leg and reached out, wrapping his small arms around Tyler's neck in an unself-conscious hug. Jennifer Hartley started crying in earnest then, and Rebecca Bennett joined her, and Michael Bennett had to turn away and pretend to be very interested in something through the front window. Tyler hugged Dylan back carefully, feeling the small body warm and alive and perfect in his arms, and something settled in his chest, some piece of understanding that hadn't quite clicked into place until this moment. This was why it had mattered. This was why the risk had been worthwhile. This small human being, with his whole life stretching out ahead of him, birthday parties and first days of school and learning to ride a bike, and eventually graduating and falling in love and maybe having children of his own someday. All of that infinite potential preserved because Tyler had made a choice in a moment of crisis. The hug lasted maybe 5 seconds, but Tyler knew with absolute certainty that he would carry it with him for the rest of his life. A reminder that sometimes the most important things we ever do happen in moments we never plan for, rising from some deep place within us that we don't even know exists until circumstances demand it. The Hartley family stayed for coffee and conversation. Dylan playing with toys Tyler's mother dug out from when Tyler was little, the adults talking about the rescue and the aftermath, and the strange process of returning to normal life after something so dramatic. Jennifer told them that she still had nightmares about that afternoon, still woke up sometimes hearing her own screaming, still felt her heart race when she drove past the lake. But she was getting counseling, working through the trauma, and having Dylan healthy and whole made it bearable. She'd learned her lesson about ice safety in the harshest way possible, she said, and would never again trust a frozen surface just because it looked solid. She'd taken Dylan to the lake the previous weekend, in broad daylight with the ice thick and reliable, just to walk along the shore and talk to him about what had happened, to make sure he didn't develop a phobia of the water. They'd stood at the spot where the rescue had occurred, the hole long since frozen over and covered with new snow, and she'd told Dylan that this was where a brave person had saved him, where someone had loved him enough to risk everything. She wanted him to grow up knowing that story, knowing that humanity was capable of extraordinary compassion. In the months that followed, life gradually returned to normal for Tyler Bennett, or at least to a new version of normal that incorporated what had happened. The media attention faded as it always does, replaced by new stories and different headlines, the news cycle moving on to the next crisis or triumph or controversy. Tyler finished his sophomore year at Winona High School, maintaining decent grades despite the distraction of occasional speaking requests from community groups and schools. He played basketball, improved his free throw percentage, helped his team to a respectable season, even though they didn't make it to state finals. He studied for the ACT, started thinking seriously about college, worried about chemistry exams and whether he wanted to pursue engineering or maybe medicine. He asked Amy Clarkson to junior prom, and she said yes, and they dated for a few months before mutually deciding they were better as friends. He learned to drive, got his license on his second try after failing the parallel parking portion the first time, and celebrated his 16th birthday with his family and close friends at a small party where nobody mentioned the rescue unless he brought it up first. But something fundamental had changed in Tyler that January afternoon, something he couldn't fully articulate but carried with him in everything he did. He'd learned that bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it, and that the value of a single human life, especially a child's life, was worth any risk. The Carnegie Medal arrived in mid-June, delivered in a wooden presentation case, with Tyler's name engraved on a brass plate. The medal itself a bronze disc suspended from a ribbon, heavy and solid, and representing sacrifice and heroism. Tyler kept it on his desk in his bedroom, not displayed prominently but present, a reminder of what he'd learned about himself and about human nature. Sometimes late at night when he couldn't sleep, troubled by teenage anxieties or existential questions about meaning and purpose, he'd take out the medal and hold it, And he'd think about Dylan Hartley, now 6 years old, starting first grade in the fall, learning to read and write, making friends, playing soccer, living the life that had almost ended under the ice that January afternoon. Tyler never regretted his choice to enter that water, not even once. Not even during the worst moments of hypothermia treatment, when his body had shaken so hard he thought his bones might break. Not even when the emergency room doctor had lectured him about risk and statistics and luck. Some decisions transcend rational calculation and self-preservation, rooted instead in the fundamental human impulse to help, to save, to refuse to stand by when action is possible. That afternoon, a 15-year-old boy with a gym bag and basketball practice behind him and homework waiting at home became something more, a testament to courage, a reminder that heroes don't always wear uniforms or carry badges, and a living example of the truth that sometimes the most important thing we ever do happens in moments we never planned for. Rising from some deep place within us that we didn't even know existed until crisis called it forth. Dylan Hartley would grow up knowing that a stranger once loved him enough to risk death for him, a knowledge that would shape his understanding of human goodness and moral obligation. And Tyler Bennett would grow old, knowing that his life had counted for something profound and irreplaceable, that in one crystallizing moment of choice he had given a child the most precious gift possible, a future, unwritten and full of infinite possibility, stretching out ahead like the thawing ice of spring, waiting to be lived.